Herzlich willkommen zum Jean-Monnet-Podcast der Martin-Luther-Universität Halle-Wittenberg. Welcome to the Jean-Monnet podcast of the University Halle.
Thank you so much, Christian. And again, it's very, very good to be here with you in Halle after 20 years. I hope to return sooner next time. And I appreciate the fact that so many of you who were with us yesterday are here again today. You were not able to join us yesterday. I understand that our proceedings are on YouTube. So if you're truly interested, you can go there later. Yesterday, in what I said, I was drawing in part from two of my books, my first book, Trade and Freedom, and a more recent book, The Willing World. Today, I'll be drawing again on The Willing World, but also on my book, Trade Links. Tomorrow, I'll be drawing on my forthcoming next book, Democracy for a Sustainable World. You'll be happy to hear that you're not required to read all of these books, and none of this will be on the final exam. But I could see from yesterday that you truly are interested in these subjects, so I'll try to help you with them as best I can, and you've already helped me with your questions, inspiring some further thought on my part about where I might want to go next. One thing I want to underscore at the outset and today is the need for optimism. I believe we have a duty of optimism. I believe that there is no other way truly to live without being optimistic. And I continue to be optimistic even in a world where there appear to be accumulating grounds for pessimism. Hence the topic today. We discussed yesterday the growing clash between those who believe in the rule of power and those who believe in the rule of law. And this is intensifying in trade. It's also appearing in many other places in our geopolitics. But our topic is trade, and those of us who believe in the rule of law and trade also, of course, believe that we need rules for trade. And if we're optimistic, then we think that there is yet much we can do to advance trade in a way that will provide for greater prosperity for all the world. And more than that, many of us believe that we must make trade more of an affirmative agent for achieving the broader goals of sustainable development. With this in mind, what should we be doing if indeed we could find the political will is required to advance the trading system? First of all, in the past 29 years since we established the WTO, we have had some successes. I mentioned a few of them yesterday. I'll mention them again now. We had an information technology agreement. We have an agreement on basic telecommunications services. We had approved the government procurement agreement. we have a trade facilitation agreement. We concluded in Nairobi a few years ago an agreement to eliminate agricultural export subsidies. And we have a very good start in an agreement on disciplining fisheries subsidies worldwide. These are not small accomplishments. However, they are small when compared to what we still need to do. And as the world turns, the lists of all we still need to do gets longer every day. If we had the political will, we would, first of all, of course, complete the accomplishment of the agenda that was set out in Doha Development Round in 2001. You will recall from yesterday that this round of multilateral trade negotiations failed 15 years later. We accomplished almost none of what we set out to do in that round, except the trade facilitation agreement. And what's left? A lot's left. There is the potential makings of a grand global deal that would, on a multilateral basis, lower all kinds of barriers to trade and thus increase the volume of trade and the opportunities for more prosperity within every one of the 166 members of the WTO. What would that deal comprise? On the one hand, developed countries especially, but all countries, could reduce significantly their agricultural subsidies. I would eliminate them entirely. 30 years ago, I voted against sugar subsidies, even though I was a member of Congress from the state of Florida, the largest sugar-growing state in the United States. I have never supported agricultural subsidies, which distort trade enormously, and which, in most instances, deny to developing countries the comparative advantages they ought to have in agricultural production. So, of course, this would mean that there would have to be cuts in the subsidies in the Common Agricultural Policy, in the agricultural subsidies programs of the United States of America, in Japan, in Norway, in Switzerland, and you may not realize, in China. China now has a vast amount of agricultural subsidies that distort world trade, and that, like the subsidies in the U.S. and the EU and elsewhere, deny to a lot of poorer developing countries what should be their rightful opportunities in world trade. There's also the matter of trade remedies. This is entirely politically sensitive in the United States, in the EU, and in some other developed countries. Trade remedies can be appropriate in the circumstances that are described in the relevant WTO agreements. The trade remedies, anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, safeguards, are all often pernicious in their impact on the trade of developing countries, and unfairly so. In this grand bargain, the developed countries could make concessions on agricultural subsidies and trade remedies in return for concessions on the part of the rest of the membership of the WTO. And these concessions could be in tariffs on manufactured goods, which unfortunately are rising everywhere with the increasing protectionism in the world. A lowering of barriers to trade and services, where developed countries such as the United States and the EU have great comparative advantages. As it is, because in the dog world we've been unwilling to impose upon ourselves the political cost of making concessions on agricultural subsidies and on trade remedies, we have denied to ourselves the opportunities that we would have from lower tariffs on manufactured goods and lowered barriers to trade and services. So the whole world, in the absence of this bargain, is less prosperous. I would add one issue here. Every 2 years, the WTO has an anguished debate over whether to extend a moratorium on taxes on electronic cars. At our most recent ministerial conference in Abu Dhabi, the decision was made to extend this moratorium one more time, but only one more time. Developing countries oppose this moratorium and want to preserve for themselves the right to tax electronic commerce because they have the mistaken impression that this would be in their economic interest and would provide them with an economic advantage. All studies show that they are wrong. What little revenue they might generate from taxing electronic commerce pales in amount to the great benefits that they can derive from not taxing electronic commerce. Yet they have yet to be persuaded of this. And this, as I said, is what might be called the inherited trade agenda of the WTO. These are not new issues. There is another list of new 21st century commercial issues in trade that likewise has not been addressed in any successful way. We have been conducting negotiations on digital trade in the WTO that have gotten basically nowhere. The greatest change in international trade of the past generation since the establishment of the WTO has been the emergence of digital trade. More and more trade every day is conducted digitally. And yet there are no rules in the WTO Treaty on Digital Trade. How in the world can the WTO in this day and age be considered a world trade organization if it does not have rules on digital trade? There's also the matter of competition policy. The European Union has been trying to encourage other members for nearly 3 decades now to conclude global rules of competition policy. I'd, for example, address a lot of the cartels that distort trade in all kinds of unfortunate ways. So far, they have not succeeded. My own country has resisted this unreasonably so. The only rules we have that approach being competition policy rules are the trade remedies rules we have, which are extraordinarily divisive and inadequate to the task of dealing with other aspects of competition policy. We need a broad group of rules relating to competition policy. There's also the matter of intellectual property. An ever-increasing portion of the value of almost every good is in the intellectual property that has gone into making it. And the copyrights, the patents, the trademarks, the trade secrets, and the like. We have an intellectual property agreement in the WTO treaty, the WTO agreement on the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And it's a good agreement. But it's 30 years old. There have been new intellectual property agreements that have been negotiated since that time. And these new agreements on the internet and on other topics ought, like the previous IP agreements that were included in the WTO treaty, be incorporated by reference as well. And we're not even trying to do that. There's also the issue of investment. Investment is the flip side of trade, and it's entirely appropriate to have rules on certain aspects of investment in the WTO treaty. We have rules on trade-related investment measures, but they are, at this point, likewise inadequate. With great effort, about 100 countries have concluded a plurilateral agreement on investment facilitation, which is sort of a companion to the trade facilitation agreement in like vein. But other members have blocked including that investment facilitation agreement in the WTO treaty. That too needs to be done. So we have an inherited trade agenda, and we have an additional agenda with the new commercial issues of the 21st century. But much as we need to conclude all of these agreements on these issues, I think by far the most important unmet task of the World Trade Organization is to reconcile trade with sustainable development. We need to make trade a more affirmative agent for sustainable development. Let me emphasize, it is simply not true that during the time of the WTO, trade has generally stood in the way of sustainable development. If you look at the record of the WTO, if you look at the cases in dispute settlement, if you look at other aspects of the trading system, you will see that it is simply not the case that trade is always automatically trumped the environment or other aspects of sustainable development. But that said, we have not harnessed the trading system to the extent we must do if we are going to truly make it an affirmative agent for sustainable development. I draw your attention to the very first paragraph from the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement, which established the World Trade Organization, an agreement in 1994 that led to the establishment of the organization in 1995. In that very first paragraph, the countries that established the WTO said that they were doing so with the aim of conducting trade and economic endeavor in accordance with the principle of sustainable development. That's a direct quote. I have been accused of trying to change the original purpose of the WTO by discouraging its transformation into an active institution in pursuit of sustainable development. But that is not so. In urging this, I am simply reiterating the original intent of those of us who created the WTO. I was there, and I know. The WTO was created at around the same time and by many of the same people who were at that time also attending the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, including the Climate Framework Convention, including the Biodiversity Convention, including the Rio Declaration, and a lot more that advanced our environmental purposes in the world. And it is not surprising at all that these same countries at the same time wanted in the WTO treaty to proclaim their support for sustainable development. So they did. And yet, in the years since, along the way, some have forgotten that this was part of the original purpose of the institution. And I think now it is important for us to remember this original purpose and not be content simply with not standing in the way of sustainable development, but rather do our very best to try to advance sustainable development on every front. And here I should add that it's important as part of this to understand that sustainable development, as I'm sure all of you know, is not simply a matter of environmental protection. In addition to the environmental pillar of sustainable development, there are also the social and economic pillars of sustainable development. All three of these dimensions of sustainable development are reflected in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of these goals. The first of them is to eliminate poverty. I'm not sure how this can be done if you don't lower barriers to trade. The second is to eliminate hunger. Again, I'm not sure how you can achieve that goal without making certain that we follow comparative advantage in agricultural trade. There are a number of these goals that are directly related to the environment. Goal 13 is to address climate change, for example. But another aspect of sustainable development is that all three of these dimensions, the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development, are all interrelated. They are all connected. And these are what I call, with respect to trade, our trade links, which is the title of my book. And there, I think we need to do a lot more within the WTO to make certain that the trade links are, in fact, linked as they should be with the right interpretations of existing rules and with the revisions that are needed of existing rules and with the negotiation of new rules. What are some of the aspects of that? Well, first of all, I would say that we have to address the links between trade and climate change. And this issue, which was once in the distant future, is now very much upon us. When I left the WTO over 20 years ago, I was invited to speak to the General Counsel. I did, and my topic was what I saw as the coming collision between trade and climate change. And those in the audience told me afterwards that they very much appreciated my service on the appellate body of the WTO, but that I was a bit wrong-headed in thinking that climate change was a trade issue. Not long afterwards, I returned to the climate movement in which I'd been engaged, or even before I went to Congress of the United States, and had set it aside from when I went on the appellate body. And I spoke in Copenhagen in 2009 and told the climate delegates there that we were approaching a collision between trade and climate change. And I was told very politely afterwards, "Thank you very much. We appreciate you coming, but trade is not a climate issue." Well, now we know better, but we have yet to see either the climate regime or the trade regime grapple fully with this coming collision, which I think will be very much upon us when the European Union's carbon border adjustment measure takes effect a few months from now. Well, what should we do? Well, there's some easy fixes. There's some that are not easy at all. As it stands, the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade, which is a part of the WTO treaty, has a bit of a chilling effect on decisions by WTO members to enact carbon taxes. It does so because it's unclear whether a carbon tax is eligible for a border tax adjustment under Article 2 of the GATT. Forgive me for being lawyerly with you. Well, that can be remedied very easily. The members of the WTO could adopt a formal legal interpretation under the WTO treaty stating that a carbon tax is indeed an indirect tax on product that is eligible for a border tax adjustment. That would, in one stroke, eliminate that chilling effect. What about other measures that are taken for climate reasons that restrict trade? One of the things I said when I spoke to the WTO General Council 20 years ago, and one of the things I've said many times since, is that in order to take the extent of climate action we must take in order to address the challenge of climate change, the trading system is going to have to permit certain climate-related trade restrictions that might otherwise be inconsistent with WTO treaty obligations. Clearly, we cannot permit measures that pretend to be climate measures but are only disguised restrictions of international trade. But in a number of instances, with not only carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but other kinds of trade restrictions, countries do and will have legitimate climate reasons for imposing these trade restrictions. And we need, for the members of the WTO, to decide where the line must be drawn between the kinds of measures that are permissible under WTO rules and the kinds of measures that are not. For this end, I have suggested that the members of the WTO enact a climate waiver. So far, none of the 166 members of the WTO are in favor of the climate waiver, but I predict that within several years, we will see the members of the WTO turn to consideration of such a waiver as a realistic option. And they will, because the other options are not very attractive. They're also limited. And furthermore, as soon as the EU opposes its carbon border adjustment mechanism, I believe we will be launched on the climate trade war. And that war will only end successfully with the drawing of that line that I've advocated. But climate change is not the only issue on which some lines have to be drawn. Equally significant, I believe, to climate change is the issue of biodiversity loss. We've just seen what was largely a failure in Colombia in the COP of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And clearly the world is not yet prepared to draw that line just as it doesn't seem to be prepared to provide financing for the poorer countries that they can mitigate and adjust to climate change or biodiversity loss. My own view is that in addition to the line drawing of a climate waiver, we must also draw other lines and other aspects of environmental preservation and protection of our threatened biosphere. This should be done in biodiversity. It should be done in agriculture. It should be done with respect to the forests. In these cases, perhaps more, I think we need to condition trade on engaging in sustainable practices. Now, this is easy for someone from the richer part of the world to say. And one problem with saying these kinds of things in Europe or the United States, Japan, is that in taking these measures, as justified as they may be, we will be imposing costs on developing countries that they cannot afford. If we are going to impose our will extraterritorially in trade with these poorer countries, then we must do two things, in my view. First of all, we must consult with them beforehand to try to minimize the negative impact of imposing these higher standards on the trade of these other countries. This is one of the things that the EU has not done that I think will not stand the EU well in inevitable dispute settlement over the seaman. That's one thing you must do. The other thing we must do is provide these other countries with the financial wherewithal to do what it is that we want them to do, but they cannot otherwise afford to do. There are going to be considerable administrative costs to these types of trade restrictions arising from our climate convictions. There are going to be a lot of changes in production practices, which will also cost money, and it is neither right nor just to impose these standards on other countries when they don't have the means to fulfill these standards. And it's this point that's been missing in much of the debate in the developed part of the world over these types of environmentally related climate restrictions, which I hasten to emphasize I largely support. But there are other things we should be doing that we're not doing that address other aspects of sustainable development. For example, look at what happened on health issues in the pandemic. Did you know that the average tariff on soap in the world is 17%? Why do we even have the tariff on soap? I'm sure there's some domestic soap producers in European countries or in the United States who can explain that to me, but to me it is utterly unjustified. And we also continue to have trade restrictions that are needless on medicines. We embarrassed ourselves in the developed world with our vaccine nationalism during the pandemic. This was immoral on our part, and also it wasn't very sensible because if you're going to stop the pandemic, the way to do it is to make certain that those who are most vulnerable to it get the vaccines first so they could stop it from spreading. We need a WTO health agreement. This too is part of sustainable development. In addition, what else have we seen in some of the economic dislocations of recent years? First with the pandemic, and more recently in the wake of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. We've seen export restrictions on food. Well, this too is a practice that is perverse because it doesn't lead to more food production. It doesn't make it possible for food to be where it's needed. It distorts markets and ultimately raises prices. We need more WTO disciplines on these types of agricultural export restrictions. As I mentioned earlier, we have the beginnings of an agreement to discipline subsidies on fisheries. This is extraordinarily, and for nearly half the people on the planet, billions of people, depend on fish as their primary source of protein every day. And yet, fish stocks are declining dangerously throughout the world. Well, I'm very proud that the WTO has, in fact, concluded a fisheries agreement. It's the first agreement ever concluded by the trading system solely for reasons of sustainability. It's a very good presser. But the agreement itself is not nearly all it needs to be. It doesn't really discipline most of the fisheries subsidies. That needs to be done. And then I would add there's the matter of fossil fuel subsidies. Talk about perversity. Here we are as a planet trying to reduce and we would hope eliminate our reliance on fossil fuels for energy. And at the same time, we're spending trillions of dollars annually to subsidize fossil fuel production. How does that make any sense? It doesn't. It doesn't at all. The last I looked, there are 14 members of the WTO trying to get the rest of the membership to pay attention to this issue and do something about it. In my view, fossil fuel subsidies should be prohibited subsidies under the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. Furthermore, we should change that subsidies agreement to make certain that you can countervail subsidies not only when they have economic harms, but when they have environmental harms as well. The good news is that the response in the WTO today to these kinds of issues is not the response I got 20 years ago when I spoke to the WTO General Counsel. Today we have ongoing what is called a strategic dialogue on trade and environmental subsidies. At present, there are 77 members of the WTO, nearly half of the membership of the WTO, engaged in this dialogue. This includes the European Union, it includes the United States, it includes China, and it includes most of what are called the major players in the system. What are they doing? Well, at this point, they're just talking. To their credit, they're also doing a lot of listening. They're entertaining presentations from scientists, environmentalists from all over the world. They're focusing on a specific listed issues. One is environmental goods and services. We have been trying for 20 years and more to eliminate the tariffs on environmental goods. Thus far, we have failed, in part because we continue to have a problem in defining environmental goods. Added to this now is a concern about the need to eliminate barriers to trade in environmental services. Think about it. How in the world can developing countries begin to adjust as they must to the changed world of climate change if they do not have access to environmental goods and services? It makes no sense not to conclude this agreement. And from the perspective of the United States and the European Union, we have comparative advantages in producing a lot of these goods and services. So it makes no sense for us not to make a priority of eliminating trade barriers to these goods and services. But this has not been the high priority it should be. Now we had at least half the membership saying in these dialogue that it needs to be a high priority. Next is the issue of trade-related climate measures. The dialogue, which is this being the WTO, known by the acronym of TESD, is looking at some of the issues that I've discussed about where we might need to draw a line to permit some climate-related trade restrictions while not permitting others. Third is the issue of subsidies, which I've also discussed. Which subsidies that are provided for environmental reasons are permissible, which subsidies that may have environmental harms are impermissible. Where should we draw those lines? Next is, surprisingly, given the stereotypes about the WTO, the issue of the circular economy. The membership of the WTO, this half of the membership, is actually actively engaged in talking about how to make our economy more circular, how to eliminate waste in the economy and make sure that our production is environmentally sound. They are just getting started on that, but I find it noteworthy that they're actually discussing this issue. It flies against all the stereotypes that much of the world has about the WTO. Then, last, then, there's the issue of plastics, which is being discussed in yet another strategic dialogue that is occurring in parallel. As I'm sure all of you know, the United Nations is trying very hard to conclude a plastics agreement. We seem to be getting closer to that. Meantime, the WTO is looking closely at the trade-related aspects of plastic production, plastic trade, plastic use, and trying to discern how trade rules might be changed to support the effort to keep plastics from destroying the planet. I'm sure you've all seen the latest evidence that tells us that microplastics are even appearing in the bodies of newborn infants. That's how bad this issue has become. And we cannot ignore it any longer. The hope is that these discussions, this dialogue, will, over the course of the next year or two, change and evolve into full-blown trade negotiations, which would then result in the conclusion of new trade rules. I'm working alongside many others to try to help make that happen. there is a proposal called the Lars Framework, which I was one of the participants, and which echoes much of what I said in Metro Trade Lakes in proposing an agenda for making the WTO more affirmative vision for sustainable development. But there are obstacles to achieving this. One is the consensus rule that is at the center of WTO decision-making, but often plagues it. Under the consensus rule, nothing is agreed until everyone is agreed on that. And this means that just one of the 166 countries can keep anything from happening in the WTO. Along with many others, I have long urged that instead of trying to do everything by consensus from the outset, we instead take the plurilateral approaches that are permitted in the WTO agreement. These would be agreements among some but not all WTO members, agreements that could then over time be expanded into fully multilateral agreements that would include all WTO members. The essence of multilateralism includes plurilateralism. Taking plurilateral approaches is simply one way of working toward eventual fully multilateral results. This has long been the case. Many of the agreements that we have multilaterally in the WTO treaty began back in the days of the GATT as GATT codes. When I first went into trade as a young negotiator, it was in the immediate aftermath of the Tokyo round, and we were charged with going around the world to talk other countries into signing these GATT codes that had been negotiated on things like dumping and subsidies and standards. Well, these GATT codes are now fully multilateral agreements, the anti-dumping agreement, the subsidies agreement, and the agreement on technical barriers to trade, from which the standards could evolve. That's one of the challenges we face. So I think it's important for all the members, even those who most ardently support multilateralism, to support plurilateral approaches, something that has not been done, unfortunately, with the investment facilitation agreement. Yes, they are right that full multilateralism is the ultimate goal, but blocking members from the WTO from concluding plurilateral agreements within the WTO does not keep plurilateral rules from being made. It simply guarantees that they will be made outside the legal framework of the WTO in non-WTO bilateral and regional trade arrangements. Now, the result of that will be that these rules will be developed. Eventually, they will expand, and the countries that are blocking anything but something that begins with a full consensus will find that they are going to be impacted by rules they played no part in negotiating. So they are, in my view, outsmarting themselves. The other and last challenge that is faced in trying to fulfill some of this lengthy agenda that I described today is the role of the United States of America. The attitude of the United States to the WTO going forward is at this point best described as uncertain. As we discussed yesterday, both of the political parties in the United States have in recent years abandoned trade multilateralism and embrace protectionism. Will they now find a way to support any of what I proposed today? If we look at the situation today, then the answer seems to be no. I do not see any political desire on the part of the United States for moving forward with the inherited trade agenda of liberalizing trade and agriculture, manufacturing, services, and more, even though it's very much in the interest of the United States and America to do so. I do not see much interest in pursuing the new commercial issues of the 21st century that I've described. One would think the United States would see that its self-interest lies in having good rules on digital trade, competition, policy, investment, and more. But this is not a priority for the United States at this time. What then about all the proposals I've made today for making the WTO more of an affirmative agent for addressing climate change? Well, the current administration has participated in the TESS dialogue, but it has not made that dialogue a priority. You would think that it would have done so given its environmental sentiments, but the U.S. has been more of a participant than a leader in this dialogue in the WTO. And it is unclear to me whether the United States will even continue to participate in the dialogue on trade and environmental sustainability in the next administration. We shall see. Well, what then should we do if the United States is not with us and it is not trying to help lead the way to where the world trading system needs to go? And what we should do is simply proceed without them. I think it's true that there's certain issues that can't really be resolved unless the United States is actively engaged in resolving them. Furthermore, I think there's certain issues that at this point cannot be resolved unless the United States and China are working together to resolve them. But this does not mean that we need to sit the rest of the world and twiddle our thumbs. There is much that can be done without the United States and even without China if we work hard enough to do it. And so I say we should proceed on all these fronts as best we can, conclude what agreements, plurality we can conclude, and work to the day when the United States will want once again to do what it has done so often before, which is lead the world to a better system of trade in a world in which we adhere to the rule of law and not to the rule of power. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Dieser Podcast wurde finanziert von der Europäischen Union. Bis zum nächsten Mal. This podcast was financed by the European Union. Take care.